where it was more subtle. He can also kind of inverse this effect and use it as a kind of occlusion on areas. Say if I've got some gradation on the helmet rolling back here and the lighting doesn't really bring that out, he can use this to override that and recreate the lighting and the shape on the surface. So inside of Photoshop, I've created a new folder called Creative Alphas just to separate the two because we've already got quite a few in the normal alphas directory. Now if Milton grabs this file, he'll know that these are the secondary alphas that aren't essential but can help him out with the retouching side of things. So once again, I'm going to load those into their own stack. And the reason why I've just swapped it up here in the details mode is so I can go by date modified and just bring in the latest ones. I'm going to drag these into that folder. And like I was saying earlier, if I go into the fall off, I can add an exposure adjustment on that. And as you can see, I can recreate the effect that we were getting earlier by darkening the edges off. Now he's got a perfect alpha in case he wants to have finer control over the reflections. So we're getting pretty close now. There's only really two things left that I'll really think about adding. One of those is the reflection that I was talking about earlier for the face to bring out some of that more shiny gold metallic effect. Because the lights we're using in HDR Light Studio are so blurry, there's only a couple of small areas like on glancing angles which really make this gold appear like it has a shiny top coat. So what I've done is I've gone into V-Ray and made a very simple black material that's fully glossy. It's just got a default Fresnel. Inside the reflection glossiness, I'm using a fall-off map, which is kind of roughly matching what we're seeing in the gold and the red material. I'm not trying to go too far off from that. I want to make sure that the front is still fairly glossy and the edges are very glossy. So as you can see, if you look in the scene files, you'll be able to see this material I've used. Now it's totally up to you if you want to go in and steal the bump mapping. Say for example in the gold, I'll just go outside here on the base. I've got a bump map set up. Now I can copy that and paste that into the bump map of this material and just reduce the effect just so the bump mapping is lining up. But basically I'm going to go into the override material. I'm going to drag that on and I'm just going to rename this material to be gloss coat. At this point there's so much detail in the project that, once again, being totally honest, my naming conventions and stuff inside the scene and how I manage things start to go a little bit out the window. But because we have to work so quickly, no one really cares. Obviously, if you guys are working in a more kind of locked down production workflow, it's going to be trickier, but I try and do things as quick as possible. So now I'm going to zoom out. You can see the HDR we're using here was the one from HDR Light Studio. So I'm going to turn this light off. Now I'm going to enable a light, and what I've done is to try and get this effect happening is first I've just started to use this override material with a bunch of different HDRs from Jorgen. So the best part about having this library set up is that every time I'm creating a lesson, I'm going to stick to the HDRs that he creates because Mastering CGI is going to be selling these on our website. Now, I think I plugged it earlier, but once these go live, for the first 2 weeks, Jorgen's going to be making 100% of the profit on those sales. So if you want to get in quick, you'll really be helping him out. And we've done that because, as you know by now, he's been such a help for me on the course by providing the HDRs to use. I'm just trying to give something back to him. So I experimented with a couple. I went back to the one I used early in the lesson to determine the materials. So in there, I'm just going to drag this over. Once again, GI is turned off. And I'm going to decrease the resolution of these renders just to see how they're affecting the material. And I've accidentally not turned on the HDR itself. It's also important to realize that inside the HDR, I've upped the resolution. If you go smaller on this, your reflections aren't going to pop as much as they should. They're going to get a little bit blurred. So if your HDR is 5K wide, make sure you've set the resolution in the texture option of the HDR to be the same. Now, because I'm not rendering any higher than 3K, I haven't gone above 7K on the HDR. Now, what I'm looking for when I'm creating this specular pass is basically something that's not going to detract from the lighting I've already got in the scene by being too bright or too detailed. I just want it to enhance the gold I've currently got so I can add that in and hopefully get a more glossy appearance coming through. So you can see with the HDR I've used earlier in the lesson, it's a little bit distracting because there's parts that just simply don't have any reflection and then others where there's just tons of light bouncing off. So I needed to go in and start experimenting with the different HDRs I've got available, and it's once again, it's just trial and error and it's a creative choice, but if you know what you're looking out for, you can sometimes get a nice starting point. So luckily he's got a pretty diverse range of HDRs. So next up, I'm going to try and use something that's still detailed, but a little bit more open and not so closed off like a studio. And if you're happy with how certain reflections are coming off, remember once again, you can always play with the gamma of the HDR to balance out how hot the reflections are and how dark the dark spots are. So I'll let this render and show you guys when it's done. So you can see once again we're getting a very similar effect where it's just too dark in some spots and too bright in others. So I'm actually going to cancel this render, and to have better real-time feedback, I'm going to once again swap to the active shade using V-Ray RT. I'm going to lower that resolution. Now I should be able to rotate the HDR in real time, adjusting the gamma as well to get the look I'm after. So when you're using V-Ray RT, just remember if you do swap to it to decrease the resolution, because if you don't, the update's going to be much slower because every time you rotate, it's having to rebuffer a 7000K 32-bit image. So now things are going pretty quickly. I'm just going to have a play with upping the gamma and the overall intensity. So without really rendering anything off, I can just see that it's not really like this isn't going to work out, because I can almost tell that it looks like it's being lit in an outdoory kind of station environment. You know, there's too much daylight pinging off the surface. So I'm going to try and swap to an interior HDRI, and once again, he's got quite a few. And I'm just trying to get a much simpler result. So now we're getting a bit closer. I can probably drop the gamma down, and hopefully from a certain angle. But I can see once again, it just looks a bit too outdoorsy. So I'll just load another HDRI. Now for different jobs, different HDRs are going to work better than others. But because I'm working with a studio lit character, it's pretty essential not to overlight things. So that's why I'm being a bit picky here in terms of deciding what's going to work out. So I ended up actually using one more HDRI, his interior apartment number 1. And it just had a very simple kind of reflection that was going all the way up on the suit itself. But things are a little bit too bright here, so I'm going to drop the gamma down to 0.9 and then decrease the overall multiplier. So now I've got something that I think can actually really help. And even though there's a bright kind of spotlight around, a bright window around the eye area, if I really want to, I can kind of paint that away or just start to see how that looks. So I'm going to swap from the production renderer now and render this off high res, and I'll show you what I mean by starting to blend this together to make the gold look a bit more glossy. So I've got the high res rendering now, and because I want to keep things consistent, if you ever get little kind of random color reflections happening on passes like this, don't be afraid in Photoshop to simply desaturate those. So it's little things like that, and it's little details like this that you need to look out for just to keep the whole project consistent, looking professional. Because if I don't remove that, what's going to happen is in the front, it's just going to go from being all nice and gold, and then you're going to get a couple of random messy looking reflections. So just because one little area on the HDRI doesn't look good. So as you know by now, I've got a pretty good eye for detail, but it really does make all the difference. So even though this HDR is working really nicely and we've got a nice soft reflection happening, keep an eye out for little things like this, where you can see in the HDR, I don't know if it's like LED or something like that reflecting. But before I can go in and overlay this into the gold, I might need to fix that in the pass itself inside Photoshop, which a simple hue and saturation adjustment could work. Or I might just go in and simply paint over it. You don't need to be like that specific with everything. So I'm going to save this off. Now there's also, I didn't really intend to use this pass for anything but the gold faceplate, but I will definitely try and see if it works on the other parts of the mesh, just because it's giving a nice kind of soft, subtle reflection into the scene. But before I do that, I might just go back into V-Ray RT, have a play with the rotation, because these two lights are hitting kind of on the very far right and left. If I can get those pinging off in a bit of a more aesthetic kind of direction, I might be able to use this to assist in making the chest and red paint areas look better. So I'm going to make a new folder for these type of passes now, the reflection passes, and I'm going to call these bonus passes. Well, that's what I used to call them in the industry anyway. So I'm going to call this gloss coat V1 underscore GW001. Once again, it's just a half float EXR file. I'm going to make a group for these files, and I'm going to go underscore and call this bonus passes as well. So now I'm going back to active shade mode, and I'll just let that load up. And I'm going to keep note, I'm going to copy the rotation, so if I need to go back to that, I've just got it saved. And now I'm just going to play with some quick adjustments, trying to get those highlights pinging across the surface a little bit better. So I quite like how I'm getting a bit of a highlight here on the inner chest, as well as this subtle reflection that we've got coming off here. Because Milton can actually go in and change the exposure of this pass so it's not so obvious, but just so we're getting something pinging off. So I'm going to go back into my beauty and disable that, and as you can see, we do have a bit of a reflection pinging off here, but it's only on the top side. So having that little bit of extra detail can help to bring out the mesh. As well as this kind of large reflection area here, it helps to show that this chest does actually round out. It's not a flat surface. So that's the type of detail I'm looking out for. Also on the inside of the neck, I'm getting a nice subtle reflection. Milton can possibly work with that. If remember, I was saying I don't like how this reflection's looking a bit ugly. I wanted to potentially change that. So that'll be right at the end of the lesson. I think I'm just going to go in and really finalize everything. So I'm actually getting pretty excited. I'm starting to get into this stuff with you, because this is the type of stuff that separates your standard personal work from a production job, you know, where it has to be perfect. So I'm going to turn on the production renderer and just set this off again, and I'll start up the recording once I'm back in Photoshop. So after letting that pass render, I've just realized that it's probably for the best if I keep the bump mapping consistent, because firstly I was relying on the reflection passes for the gold plating. Now I'm going to try and get something working for the chest. What I've done is in this red material, it consists of two different layers. So the base metallic layer has its own bump, and the gloss coat has its own bump also. So I've gone in, taken the composite map out of the top coat, pasted it into the bump map of this new glossy material. Then I've gone into the base material like the red, and I've pasted that in underneath everything. So now we've got the bump mapping from the red material up the top here, and the top coat on the gloss part of this shader. So to get this blending through, I'm just going to drop this down to about 50%, and I'm just going to halve everything here that was there. Now I should be able to see the bump mapping come through, and if I render this, and I'll just go over the head area, you can see where everything's smooth at the moment. Now we should get a little bit of subtle rippling happening. And you can see it's just adding a tiny bit in there, which the real practical suit has. As you can see, it's just causing a little bit of that real subtle detail to make the surface not look so perfect. So I'll wait for this to render, and then I'll bring this back into Photoshop. So while I've got that rendering, I'm going to go into Photoshop, and I'm just going to try and fix this issue here. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just select the area and just add a hue and saturation to it, and see if desaturating that helps. And you can see it does, but on top of that I really need to go in and kind of hand paint this out. So I'm going to go above this layer, I'm going to sample the color next to it. I'm just using my mouse here. I know I could use the tablet, but and just like that, I can get rid of it. Now I'm just going to paste that down. Now I don't even need that hue and saturation over the top. Just going to make sure it's not reflecting anywhere else, and it isn't. So I've got those two bonus passes up the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the top layer, and I'm going to simply minimize this reflection coat to the mask now. So I'm going to go in, you can see I've got my mask layer here. I can go control layer and copy that. Before I do this, because I might want to use this layer a bit later, I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to change the naming convention for this, and I'm going to call this mask reflection, or actually faceplate. going to apply the mask. So now you can see that's only affecting the faceplate area. Now before I can really make this sit in and work with the mesh, I've got to do a couple of adjustments. So the first thing I'll do is I'll set this to linear dodge, and you can see how it starts to affect things. This is where the power of retouching really comes in handy, because even though I'm rendered something that's completely gold, because we're dealing with a 32-bit file here, I can make some very heavy color adjustments to match that gold look that I've got behind it. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is make a photo filter. So down the bottom, I'm going to add that, and then I'm going to hit Control-Alt-G to link it just to that reflective layer. I'm going to set it to be a custom color, and I'm going to start to slide this up. Now you can see the reflections are starting to match a little bit better. Just going a bit brighter on the color, you can see the before and after. Next up, I'm going to adjust the reflections to be a little bit brighter now. So I'm going to add an exposure adjustment to this. Once again, I'm using Control-Alt-G to link that. And now I'll just have a play with trying to bring those reflections out. And you can see the brighter I go, the more chromy the material looks. So I'm just dropping off on the gamma a bit to decontrast the layer, and it's just bringing out a little bit more of a subtle reflection. I'm going to go back into the photo filter now and just kind of increase the contrast again, because you can see it was just a little bit too desaturated. I'm going to get things matching there. Now from here, there's a couple of things I can do to alter the image, and this is where Milton would probably do it, but just for the sake of explaining the whole process in this lesson, Milton is going to go in and redo this stuff obviously and teach it in a more controlled way. He's going to get a bit more creative, but I always like to, before giving a file off to the retoucher, do my best to give them the vision that I had in mind, and then I let them run with it from there. So I'm going to go all the way back down to the beauty layers here, and on the head file you can see where I've got things set up. I don't like how there's just a lot of brightness in this area of the mask. It just looks a bit uneven compared to the right side. So I'm going to go in and add an exposure adjustment layer, link that to the head pass, and I'm just going to drop the saturation down until it's a bit darker. Now I'm going to fill that layer by using Alt backspace with black, and now I'm just going to use the Wacom pen to paint in to this area, hitting X to swap the colors around, and I'm just going to very subtly paint this in. I don't really want to affect too much up here, up the top. It's just down the bottom. So now I can go back in and kind of decrease this. Just if I go too far, you can see it looks a bit uneven. So I'm just trying to balance that out a bit. So I'm happy with that, but the top coat gold's probably just a bit too strong. So I'm going to go all the way back up the top now, and inside that exposure adjustment layer, I'm just going to play with kind of reducing the effect here. And it sometimes can just take a little bit of time, because even though I don't want to skip anything in the lesson, there are moments where you're making some pretty heavy creative choices and you've really just got to sit there and play with it for a little bit. You know, you can't stick with, you know, sometimes it just takes a bit of extra time to really narrow down and refine all these details. And at the end of the day, it's not like it's taking that long. You know, if the render took an hour, you can be rendering another beauty pass, say in a production environment, while I was rendering the chest. I'd be working on these areas inside of Photoshop while waiting for that render to take place. So everything can get done very quickly. Now also remember, I know I've been doing quite a lot of work on this darker version, but what I'm going to have to do is because of the workflow issue inside of V-Ray, where I couldn't rely on the curves, is I'm going to have to try and match that curve. So what I'll do is I'll flatten the image a bit later, and I'm just going to copy this to give you an example now before I go too far into this process and you're getting a bit confused. I'm just going to paste a new layer here and make this an 8-bit file. Now, in the same way that the V-Ray frame buffer is applying a curve in 32-bit but saving it out in an 8-bit file, I don't have that option in 32 bits inside of Photoshop. It doesn't have a curves adjustment layer. So I either have to go down to an 8-bit file or a 16-bit file where I can apply the curve to match the look that I was getting outside of the V-Ray frame buffer. So if I had a curves now, I can go in and you'll see now it's starting to look a lot more like what I had going in previous versions inside of V-Ray. So I'm going to do all the work I can in the 32-bit file, and then from there I'm going to give Milton two versions. One version is going to be the 32-bit and the other version is going to be the 8-bit file that he knows he can do all his work in, drag the collapsed version into this file and then get started in there. You know, because he might want to adjust. You can see as I make the curves brighter here, the glare and blooms looking a little bit too strong on the gold itself. So that's where he'd go in down the bottom. He'd make some adjustments to this glare and bloom pass that's kind of popping up over the top. He'd put an exposure adjustment on, link it just to the bloom and glare, and drop that off a bit. If I just go to 100%, you'll see what I mean. Then he would collapse the file down again. And now you can see the blare and gloom's just a little bit less obvious. But we're still getting that nice shiny gold reflections popping off on the surface of the mesh. So I'll leave that up as reference. Now I'm not exactly sure that's the curve I want, and I have done a little bit of playing in another retouch file. So I'm just going to pause the recording, do a bit more experimentation now that I've come this far, and just really determine the correct curve I want to use. So in the end, there really wasn't much of a difference anyway. Basically, I saved out of V-Ray the color correction curve, and if I just load that, I'll just show you how you can do that. This curve I've got enabled here. You just right click and save this file out, and you can save it as a Photoshop curve file. Inside of Photoshop, you can go here in the Properties tab and go Load Curve Preset, and from there you can load the same curve. Now I've managed to match that, so you can see it's created a couple of points here to recreate that effect. On my own custom curve inside of Photoshop, I've just got the 1 point, and it's pretty much doing the exact same thing. So it's not really essential. It just comes down to being a creative choice. But there's a couple of things now that I've applied the curve and I've got that gold kind of showing off in its final form, I just wanted to go in and see if there was a couple of creative choices I could make. So on the faceplate, at the moment, it's set to linear dodge and it's fully 100% opaque, so it's showing through 100%. I just want to try changing this to normal and then just dropping off on the opacity here. Basically, I'm just darkening everything off. Now you can see the difference in the highlights. They go a bit softer. I'm going to flatten this and drag this over. And I'm just going to compare the two. Now you can see that one's a little bit less over bright. It's got the same gold feeling without all the highlights needing to be blown out. Because Milton can later on, if he's got a little bit more control over that, he can go in and actually blow these out himself a bit later. I just feel it looks a bit nicer like this, especially down here on the sides. So we're starting to get a fairly detailed Photoshop file set up now. And even though I haven't made too many adjustments with the stuff I brought in, I just want to show you a couple of examples of what can be done with some of these passes. So I'm going to turn off the bonus passes here. And inside some of the creative alphas, I'm going to select the worn edges and I'm going to copy and paste that. Now at the top, I'm going to make another folder and I'm going to call this GW_adjustments. And I'm going to go in and make an exposure layer. Now that's automatically going to create an alpha. So I'm going to go into the channels directory and paste that alpha that I've created earlier and just show you the type of stuff that we do in the print industry to really enhance the models and sometimes bring out edges that you couldn't otherwise do. So let me just bring over the adjustment properties here. Now if I go higher on this, you can see what starts to happen is we get edges that are pinging that didn't really show up before. So let me go to 100% here. Areas like around here on the sides of things, you know, we got that extra bit of control. Now obviously this isn't intended to be used everywhere. So what Milton will do is he will just paint away the areas that he doesn't want. So if he doesn't want, sorry, let me just invert that. If he doesn't want anything affecting around the mask, he can just simply paint that away. But that's going to be totally up to him. I mean, the sole intention of this is to get this exact effect where you've got detail popping that you just couldn't bring out in the shaders or the lighting. It's just very subtle, but it can just help bring out details. So I'm just going to leave that there. I'm just going to increase the intensity so Milton kind of knows what it's there for. But I'm going to turn off those adjustments. Now obviously he can also go in and use the ambient occlusion pass, and if I just set this to multiply, you can see how it just helps darken off areas like I was saying earlier underneath parts. But I've always found that overdoing the ambient occlusion can detract from the realism. So I always try and caution the retouchers to go easy on it and only use it in areas where it's really essential. Like for example underneath the chin. And maybe in cracks like this or in the darker areas of the mesh. Anywhere that's being heavily lit, I try and suggest them not to rely on it. For example, like inside the neck area here where we're getting a lot of bounce light and it's just simply taking away from that detail. Now the very last thing I do once I'm happy with everything else in the scene is go into HDR Light Studio and just take a quick look at Photoshop to see if there's any edges or highlights that I want to get catching that I couldn't really achieve in any of the lighting beforehand. Now these are going to be rendered as simple bonus passes using our previously made reflection material. So inside of HDR Light Studio, I'm just going to swap to the production renderer here because I don't need to rely on V-Ray RT for this. I'm just going to go in, I'm going to create a new light. And say for example, Milton wants me to create a highlight for the top of these shoulder packs to separate them from the chest area. I'll go in and just make a bright light and just place very, just trying to be very careful with how I position this stuff. And you can see just that subtle difference there. When I zoom in now on that area, we're getting a nice highlight spread. So I might play with the overall width of the light and the height. But really, these passes are only going to be utilized for very specific areas on the mesh. So now back inside of V-Ray, I'm going to go and turn off the back HDR that we had set up, which was Jorgen's, and I'm going to turn on the HDR for HDR Light Studio. Now when I render, I'm going to go back into the global switches and just make sure that I've got that override material on. So I'm going to render this off. Now sometimes I don't even bother waiting. I'm just going to render the area I want. And I'll start the recording again once this is done. So now that you can see this is finished, just having that simple light to catch the very subtle reflections on different edges, like even for example up on the faceplate here and up on the top of the head where it joins, little things like that is what I'm trying to look out for when I add these passes. So I'm not trying to focus on the main specular, I'm just trying to catch small edges. So I'll probably do one more light, maybe two, and then just bring those into Photoshop and experiment with how Milton might add them. And hopefully he can kind of take it from there. So I'm just going to load the first one up to make sure it's all good. And I'll make sure this is in the right spot in the bonus passes. I'm just going to drag this up to the top. I'm going to apply a hue and saturation adjustment layer to this, set to colorize. And I'm going to try and make this a lot more red than it actually was before, and that's just to blend in with the red coat underneath. So I'm going to link that to that layer. Now you can see these highlights look a little bit more accurate, and they're probably a bit too strong. So I can go down on the opacity of this layer. It's actually, as I use the colorize, I think it's just something to do with 32-bit. It's actually bringing some of the blue into the main highlight there, which I was just trying to avoid. So what I'll do is I'm just going to apply an alpha to that layer. I'm going to fill the alpha with black, and I'm only going to paint this in where I want it. So very subtle things like that, you know, they just do make the difference between a personal job and a pro job. You can see just the subtle detail that gets added inside the cheeks here. And because of that blue tint, I'm going to try and put a photo filter over the top instead. So I'm going to go up on the opacity and go back to 100, except this time I'm going to link an exposure adjustment on top, and I'm going to try and decrease the radius on those highlights and adjust them that way. I'm just grouping these together for the sake of file organization, and I'm just trying to give you a feel for what's possible. So I'm going to go back into HDR Light Studio now, and I'm going to make a new light. And I'm just kind of clicking around here just to see if there's any areas that, you know, catch some nice highlights. So for example, up on the top of the head, let me just close this. You can see I don't really have much depth or shape, even though in this version we've got a little bit. Maybe this is an area where I need to try and add something. So I'm going to go into the opacity ramp of this light and just change it to be a bit more soft. Now right now what I'm doing is I'm creating just a very soft reflection on all areas of the mesh. So if Milton decides to go in and use some of this, he's got a kind of nice evenly lit surface to take from. But like I said, sometimes it's just hard to avoid overlighting things. So I'm just having a play here, and I think I'm going to stick with just using the two lights here. So I'm going to re-render this inside of V-Ray. And I'll bring these into Photoshop once it's done. So I'm going to stop the render here because I can see on the left I've got a really nice highlight pinging off the faceplate, but then on the right side it's kind of smack right in the center. I'm going to try and balance that out and get the same effect I've got going on the left so that the faceplate's evenly lit. So just cancel this render. Now in this light, I'm going to maximize the viewport, zoom in just so I've got a clear view of everything. And now I'm going to adjust the intensity of the light. You can see I've got something that's a bit closer matched. And now I'll re-render everything. And this will be the last pass I produce. From here, it's basically just going to be going over one more time in the Photoshop file to explain what's been done, so that when I pass all this stuff off to Milton, you've got a really good idea of how to start the retouching course, where the CG workflow stops, and where his stuff begins. So the pass is nearly done now, and as you can see, I've positioned the lights to be very large on the left and right, just so that any highlights that I missed in that previous render get picked up. Now, because of the long tail spread, it means that only the very center of the light has a fairly large value. So Milton can go in and make an exposure adjustment on this layer and kind of localize the highlights just to the edges of the object. I personally feel it gives things a kind of expensive look when you go in and add these extra passes, and it's very tempting for me not to go into the Photoshop file and start working on this stuff. But that's the reason why I've created the Mastering Retouching course with Milton. It's so that I can stop where I usually would in the production phase, get on to the next lesson, and then Milton takes a hold of that and shows you how to actually professionally use all these passes. Because I know in the Mastering V-Ray finale, I had a go of it myself, but at the end of the day, in all honesty, I'm just a rookie when it comes to the retouching side of things. I know the type of stuff that retouchers do to images, but every single time I've ever worked with one and seen the before and afters of the renders I've given them, I'm always usually very surprised at just how much they're capable of achieving. Now, I have worked with pretty much the best retouchers in the world, give or take a few companies. So I'm kind of fortunate in that I know what they're capable of and don't feel limited when it comes to giving them files, because if you're working with a retoucher who doesn't know how to work with something like this, it's probably better just to try and at least learn yourself what you're able of achieving and then simplify it for them. So don't give them anything but the alphas to work with. And it might seem a little bit selfish, but the fact is, not all this work you're going to do is always going to get utilized. I'm just trying to show you an example project which has pretty much every single thing you can throw at it for the retoucher, because I really want the Mastering Retouching course to start with a bang and prove to you guys the value that retouching has in the pipeline. Another topic I wanted to cover before I wrap the lesson up was the use of LUT files within inside the V-Ray frame buffer. I was originally going to put more focus on these in the lesson, but because I've had so much experience in Octane compared to V-Ray RT, and I'm relatively new to the workflow, and there's still a few unsolved questions since creating the support thread on that, like I was talking about in the intro to this lesson, I've decided to kind of push it back a bit, wait until I've got some more solid understanding of what's going on here and how to imitate certain looks inside of Photoshop and kind of compare them to the V-Ray frame buffer. Because the first thing to understand when using LUTs is that it won't save out. So you've got to try and load it in somewhere else, for example Photoshop or After Effects or Nuke. So if I just go inside the V-Ray frame buffer, I'm going to turn on the LUT menu here, and you can see I've just downloaded a couple of free ones. I'm going to try and provide links to these. I've actually downloaded these quite a while ago, but basically you've just got the option. I think Lele in the support thread kind of described it as Instagramming. So basically it's just a quick way of altering the look of your render. Now sometimes linear renders just don't look photoreal, and it takes a kind of distorted view of them or changing the colors around to really kind of start to see things realistically. So if I go in here and load, this is one of my favorite LUTs. Now whenever I load a LUT here, sometimes the LUTs itself bake in the gamma, and you've got to undo that. So if you turn off the sRGB space, you should be able to see that a little bit more clearly how they were intended to look. Now if I take the curves off and zoom in here, it's done some quick color changes. Inside the blacks now, they're not so perfectly dark, and that's one of the biggest things inside V-Ray which can kind of detract from the overall realism, just having way too much contrast. Now I usually like to work with a curve while having these on, and inside of Octane the comparison would be to adjust the gamma, and I'm trying to kind of simulate my own fake gamma here by adjusting these curves. But there's a couple of different LUTs I like the look of. Of course you can go in and I've got a few. I'm sure you can find places where to download these. Some of them give a more vintage look, and just in my personal opinion, I start to feel like it's it takes the renders away from that kind of very standard colored and saturated look that you get straight out of V-Ray. Now you can find online, obviously the files I'm loading don't have examples, but on the websites where I took these from, a lot of these files show you before and afters on kind of stock backplates, so you get a feel for what LUT is going to, do to your image overall. Now, not all of them look good. And inside of Octane on different projects, I'll use different LUTs or different response curves and just play with it until I get something that looks realistic. So until we have the LUTs from Octane, I'm going to kind of hold off trying to implement those into a workflow in a mastering lighting lesson. But hopefully in one of the next couple of lessons I release, I can dive more into that. Now, in the meantime, with my limited understanding of how to go about matching these inside Photoshop, because it varies from LUT file to LUT file, what you're going to need to do first though is go to the FNORD website and download the Cineon Converter for Photoshop plugin. Once you've installed that, you'll see up in Photoshop in the filter directory, there's an FNORD category. So if I go down, I've loaded up the beauty pass that I've saved out of V-Ray, which is just the linear file with sRGB on, with the LUT turned off. You can see they're the exact same. What I'll do is I duplicate the layer. Let me just delete this. Go to Filter, FNORD, and Cineon Converter. I'm going to leave the gamma at 1 and do a lin to log transfer. Now on the top of this, I can load up my color lookup. That's the same, so I've loaded that from the same directory, 3DLC basic version 1. And then on top of this, I've just got to undo the sRGB. So it's just a rough approximation because sRGB isn't a linear curve. So I've just put a 0.45 gamma adjustment over the top, and now you can see inside of V-Ray with the LUT enabled and sRGB off, we're matching within, give or take a little bit here and there. So that's the best I can do at the moment. So really, at the moment, like I said, I'm not fully sure of how to incorporate this stuff into a proper workflow because I'm so used to just having them work out of the box in Octane. But I will have a crack at this over the next couple of lessons. So I'm going to speak to Milton about this. For now, I'm just going to give him this file, so if he wants to, inside of Photoshop, he can load his own LUTs and apply them. So for example, now I can match what's happening in V-Ray in Photoshop. I don't need to reconvert everything with this workflow, and it should just work out of the box. So you can see here, if I load the Vibe 1, it's not perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's close enough. And let's just say I collapse this file now and there's something I really like about the way the look makes the gold appear or something like that. I can drag this into our file and go down the very bottom now. If I grab an alpha, say for just the overall character itself, and mask this off, Milton might decide that there's certain things that can work from this pass and blend those in that help with the realism of the shaders. I'm just having a play with a couple of different settings here. So it just gives him options. Now I'm going to go all the way up the top, above the top of the file, and I'm going to actually delete this alpha. I'm going to go in and grab an alpha for the faceplate. And I'm going to apply that. And you can see my Photoshop's kind of wigging out a little bit here. Now I'm just using the faceplate with that lookup. And Milton might decide that this looks better than, say, what I've currently got. And at least he's just got the option then to play with that type of stuff in post. Alright guys, that about wraps up this lesson. It's been an extremely challenging but also rewarding experience for me to get out a lesson like this, which is by far the most detailed one I've ever done. Every time it seems like the lessons get a bit harder and they take a bit longer to create, but you know, as you guys know, it's been taking too long to get content out for you. But every single time I've ever delayed a lesson or I've ever been a bit lazy and put too much focus on the boxing, I always pull it back and I always try and give you exactly what you deserve. I promised myself that I'd make this course better than Mastering V-Ray, and we're only 3 lessons in and I already feel like I'm going in that direction. The next lesson is going to be on a Cadbury chocolate job or something like that. It's not exactly going to be Cadbury, but I'm going to teach you how I've lit and rendered chocolate in jobs, which is going to require, once again, a combination of HDR Light Studio and V-Ray lights. We're also going to be going in a little bit more finer detail into the shading of a scene like that. Because I've already showed you how to do shaders like the Iron Man's material, I kind of put that a bit aside on this lesson. But at the end of the day, I'm extremely proud of how this has turned out, and it's been really tempting to push this to how I'd like to be, how I'd like to see it. And it's been a long time since working in production now, over 1.5 years. So I'm pretty excited to see what Milton can do. If you've got any questions about that course, feel free to email me. We're getting really close now. Milton's really excited to get started. We're currently running through some trial runs, trying to get his recordings kind of up to scratch so that the content's of a similar nature to the Mastering V-Ray and Mastering Lighting courses. Look out for some updates I'm going to be posting on the Facebook page on that Cadbury job over the next few days. I'm not taking any breaks because, as you know, I've broken my hand twice now in the last couple of months, and it's going to give me a lot of time to work on the course instead of boxing. I've decided to take a bit of a break. I think I've run my body into the ground just trying too hard there, and at the end of the day, it's not really helping anyone. So hopefully this lesson's kind of gained a little bit of that trust I lost from you guys, and I'll keep that momentum going for the next one. Cheers guys, I'll see you next time.